is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name is Mark Reiboldt. I'm the host of the podcast. And on today's episode, we have a couple of guests that have been on the podcast before, and they're part of our Coker team, and they specifically work within our compensation consulting group. And that's going to be a little bit about what we're talking about today, but I'm happy to have joining us Alex Kirkland and Matt Jensen. The topic for today's discussion is actually something that Coker has had in the works here for the better part of almost a year now, actually, the full year 2022. And what we're talking about is the Advanced Practice Provider, the APP Strategy and Oversight Survey that Coker actually put together at the end of 2021. We went through a collection and analysis phase for gathering the data for the survey over the first 2 quarters of 2022, and the initial results were published in June of this year. So the results have been out now as we record this for a few months, but this is the first chance we've actually had to talk about it on the podcast. Alex and others have been able to collaborate with some different organizations as far as going through some of the findings and looking at some of the takeaways from the research, which were actually very insightful. So we're going to talk about that today. So I'm happy to have Alex and Matt join me for that. Before we do, as always, I like to cover a little bit of housekeeping, just real briefly. Again, we want to thank everybody for listening and tuning in. I want to encourage you guys, if you like this type of content, this type of topic, please go through the rest of our episodes for Coffee with Coker. You can find all of our episodes, download them, listen to them for free right on our website at coffeewithcoker.com. And as always, I like to mention you can find all of Coker's thought leadership published work on our website at cokergroup.com. And there's a lot there as far as white papers, articles, blogs, etc. So really good stuff. And then we really want to encourage folks, if they're not already signed up for our email newsletter, we have content going out weekly, and sometimes even more frequently, but it is always very insightful, very helpful in terms of thought leadership on all the different areas that Coker covers in our consulting purview. So with that, we thank you guys once again for listening, and I want to jump right into the discussion with Alex and Matt here. So Alex, Matt, I think the best place to start here is tell us a little bit about the background of the survey. What drove the need? Why did you guys ultimately have the idea that this would make sense to do in light of there's a lot of data, a lot of surveys, research going on out there? What purpose does this fill?
Thanks, Mark. We, as healthcare consultants, leverage on survey data quite a bit, and we utilize that for many different purposes. And one of those driving purposes is for compensation and productivity insights. And we do see APP compensation and production logged within the major player surveys, but we don't see a lot of insight into how those APPs are being utilized, what's driving the need to add another APP, and some other factors like how much CME do you afford your APP on an annual basis from an organizational standpoint. And so what we wanted to do was not necessarily replicate the MGMA and other surveys that are out there that are capturing some of that compensation and productivity insights, but more so create a survey that was complementary to it to answer some of those strategy and oversight questions that I was speaking of. And it helps us understand, how physicians may what barriers do they face when determining whether or not they would oversee an APP? What, from a specialty perspective, where do we see APPs having the greatest impact of care right now? Do you sign non-competes? We've heard anecdotal evidence about this over the years and have a sense of what this all looked like, but we were really trying to better quantify what some of these insights may yield. And so that's what the survey allowed us to do so. And Matt, you want to comment just about how widespread the survey is as far as how many providers reported into it and all of that kind of some of the demographic information?
Yeah, sure. So for the survey, we had 60 different organizations who responded to the actual questionnaire that we posted out there that ended up representing over 3,000 APPs, and of the same group, a little more than 4,300 physicians. Most of the questions revolve around APPs and APP strategy, oversight. There are a few questions about physician oversight of APPs, so we included numbers on the physicians covered as well.
And now, and Matt, I think you kind of, when we were talking about this before, you made some comments around the purpose of the survey. And Alex, you alluded to this. There's a lot of quote unquote survey data out there when it comes to compensation and productivity for all kinds of providers. But, you know, this is a little bit different from a benchmarking survey, right? Or a benchmarking research effort. So maybe
That's
speak
right.
to that a little bit about kind of the purpose of this as far as filling in some of the gaps versus providing benchmarking data.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of the compensation surveys that other healthcare consultants are familiar with are very numbers driven and very heavy into, you can run percentiles on different metrics and whatnot. Our survey gets into a little bit of that around some oversight, stipends and a few metrics, but the majority of our survey is really more qualitative in nature, discussing operational strategy and metrics that you don't necessarily put into percentiles and run data analytics on.
And I think that's important. It's an important point to make because I know for years, one of the biggest challenges in working with clients when we're utilizing any sort of benchmarking survey is you can glean a lot of information, obviously, from data, the quantitative piece. And like you said, Matt, looking at percentiles and breaking it down by region and all of those different things, extremely helpful in a lot of direction in a lot of different ways. However, oftentimes, when we're doing that analysis, there's a heavy degree of context that has to be added to that. And kind of it's not just the numbers in black and white on a spreadsheet. There truly is more context that needs to be understood as far as what does this mean? And can you take this on, as it's presented on the surface, this one data point, or is it, one data point in a much broader picture that requires additional context? Would you agree?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was truly our goal in putting this survey together, was to fill in some of those gaps that we just don't have a lot of insight into by looking at numbers from the other compensation surveys.
Mm-hmm. And why the need for this? I mean, we talked about trying to answer some of those questions, but we really foresee a growing need to better understand APP utilization, APP compensation factors, those types of things, because there's such a high growth projections for advanced practice providers over the next 10 years. In fact, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, physicians assistants and nurse practitioners are expected to grow by 31% and 45% respectively until 2030. And I think there's a lot of factors that are going into that. It's a really good profession for one, being a care provider. But number two, we are during that same time frame expect to see the widening gap in the physician deficit and what the supply looks like compared to the demand, and the aging demographics the country has, what the population looks like, how many providers are needed, all of those types of things. And so where we foresee a lot of organizations kind of positioning their provider strategy is bolstering their APP utilization. And in some markets, it may be very difficult to recruit physicians. And so can APPs be leveraged as the care strategy in some of those areas? And we're absolutely seeing that play out.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that we're already seeing, compared to just maybe 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago and beyond, the utilization and role of the APP is just, it continues to grow more and more. And as you said, Alex, it definitely will continue in that direction. So this is extremely helpful, and filling in some of those gaps, I think it's just very important for people to understand. And I should have mentioned this going in, but if people are interested in some of our findings and the takeaways and the analysis from the survey, we'll make sure the links are available to what we have out there publicly at this point. And then, of course, I always like to say, if folks want to dig a little bit deeper and understand at a more detailed level what was entailed here and some of the findings, we'll absolutely make sure you have Alex and Matt's contact information so that you can have a conversation. They'd be more than happy to speak with anyone about this if you're interested. And so with that, let's dive into some of that, I guess, as far as what did we learn? What were some of the key takeaways, or at least maybe we can cover it from a high level here. And then again, folks can learn more from all the other work that you guys have put together on this. But let's start with, the utilization piece. Alex, you were just talking about the expanding role of APPs and the utilization that's going to be the growing trend going forward. So what are some of the things we learned from the survey about the utilization piece there?
We tried to capture the data into different care types. So I'll speak about all specialties, but we do have further breakdown for primary care specialists, anesthesia, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But we were trying to understand what are the key drivers for your strategy to increase the utilization of APPs. Improving access was the overarching driver. That's where organizations are trying to be able to increase market share, schedule new patients, get them in the door faster. Improving efficiency and quality is another area. How do you allow the physician to operate at the top of their license, perceivably by getting APP support to do some of the follow-up visits so that the physician can focus on higher acuity type patient encounter, and then responding to growth. And I think this is kind of a reactionary element as far as how we see a lot of healthcare entities merge and continue to grow. And it seems like everywhere you look, healthcare entities are combining forces and growing. And I think that means that there's a recognition of new market share and new geographic areas that have to be cared for. And there's a provider strategy that kind of goes into those aspects.
And I know even in years past, we've seen many different types of APPs really move into becoming almost the primary provider for patients. I mean, we've seen that in a good bit of OB care, of course, primary care, even some of the specialties that, non-surgical specialties, but, where it's becoming the norm just to interact with the APP, even more so than the MD, perhaps. Is that something you guys see both from the survey data as far as the current state of things, as well as the likely trend in the future?
We are. And, patient access is a team game. And so it's not just the physician questions, it's for the whole care team. Mm-hmm. That with the APPs being key providers within that care team, certainly going to have a factor into that. But one of the questions that we did garner insight into are panel sizes. And I know this is predominantly a primary care focused question, but we did gain insights into what we see of the organizations that we responded to our survey. What are their average panel sizes, and what within a range? And I think that we see typically it's 750 to 1,000 patients that they would be managing. A little bit lower of an expectation than the physician side. Mm-hmm. We see a lot of organizations, though, that do not credit or count panel at the APP level. Instead, it goes to the physician level. There's different ways of measuring and counting that panel credit. But for instances where we do see APPs receive that credit, manage that panel, we see that 750 to 1,000 ranges being the most common range out there. We certainly see higher, we certainly see lower as well. But we are absolutely, I think by having recognition of APPs managing their own panel, it speaks to how they are the predominant provider of care, like you were just speaking to.
Were there any takeaways there in those types of numbers as far as what type of organization those APPs may be affiliated with? Meaning, were you seeing that more in an employed physician network of a health system, the kind of that primary care arm, or is it on the private practice setting, or both, or something else?
It's going to be depending on how you count patients. And so the two most common ways of counting patients is that you can log in your system who that patient's primary provider of care is, or you could do an attribution methodology where you're going back and measuring which provider saw the most that patient over the most encounters over the past 18 months or whatever look back period you want to look into. And what we'll see is different organizations measure that in different ways. On the employed versus primary or private practice side, in private practice you'll always see it get attributed to the physician because they're going to get the credit likely within their income distribution plan.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
That is a great question, though, Mark. And one of the benefits of having run this survey ourselves is that we do have insight into that kind of granular level. So if there are folks who have questions, who want to dig deeper into some of the details of private practice versus hospital-based or whatever, we do have that detail to dig further in and pull some further insights out.
Yeah, I was curious because, and this will tie into my next question here, but in terms of, and Alex, your point is, I think, very important for folks to understand, because it really is about how that utilization is ultimately tracked or attributed. And that's going to vary, but there may be some opportunities here, whether you're on the private practice side and you're looking to update or adjust your strategy for APP utilization versus maybe on the hospital side, maybe there's something different there. And the trends may help point in terms of where we are now, may point a little bit in terms of the direction that they may be going in the future. But like I said, that kind of ties into my next question here, and either one of you feel free to jump in. But, when you think about what different organizations, and again, it may vary by the type of organization, but what did you guys find, and what are you seeing as far as how organizations are either crafting their strategy around utilization of APPs or maybe adjusting their existing strategy on how they're using APPs?
One of the insights that we garnered was, well, I guess first to answer your question, I think we're seeing it in response to improving access. How are they thinking about team-based care? Some of those dynamics. The next thing to consider is, how is that physician going to interact with the APP? And those were some key insights that we garnered from the survey as well. Does the organization allow the physician to choose whether or not they're going to oversee an APP? Overwhelmingly, that answer is yes, but we do see barriers for physicians are wanting to oversee experienced APPs, and one of the reasons is because the most of the time involved in overseeing an APP is just answering those questions. It's chart reviews is very much lower on the list than that, and some of those other areas that we get captured insights into. But how can we remove some of those barriers, take off some of that reputational risk off the physicians? And where we see the desire is that, for APPs that have several years of experience, there's a lot more desire and apt to want to oversee them. And so one of the things that we think about within the survey, and is that we talk with our clients about, is there an inherent incentive for the physician to oversee the APPs, or is there an actual monetary incentive to oversee the APPs? And so we got into that as well, trying to understand what that looks like, if there is an oversight payment that's made. And if there is, kind of how is that structured? And it can be done, many different ways. But it was very insightful to kind of see all of that and have, data pulled together that could help quantify some of those details.
I was going to say that was one of the more interesting takeaways for me from the survey data was what are some of those barriers that exist to physicians' willingness to provide APP oversight. And like Alex mentioned, that time commitment was one of the biggest ones. And there was a big difference in time commitment, of course, between overseeing newer, inexperienced APPs versus experienced APPs. And the willingness to oversee experienced APPs was, of course, much higher than to take on some of those newer ones. So that was interesting. The other thing that was a bit interesting was looking at some of the dynamics between regions around the country. So the respondents that we had to the survey span the whole country. We are nearly 30 states, and just seeing the difference in physician hesitancy to work with APPs seemed to be much higher in the South and Midwest versus either coast. So that was just kind of interesting facts about some of those. I think where that's really helpful is just understanding what some of those barriers are going to be so that administrators can have that knowledge going into bringing more APPs in and address those barriers up front. I think is something that this survey provide.
Yeah, kind of going back and connecting the dots, we're seeing the reticence for physicians to oversee the APPs for those newer APPs that have just gotten credentialed because there's more time that's involved in answering those questions. But as we look at the growth projections, there's going to be lots of new APPs over the next 10 years. And so it's an important factor to deal with. What we've done in some work is we've worked with clients to structure if they are providing a stipend for that APP oversight, it may differ based on the APP's years of experience, where maybe there is a higher amount that's afforded to the physician for that introductory period as they're getting acclimated to the APP. And while we've positioned it as years of experience, there's also a getting to know you period. Not to say that there would be a differential in compensation for that, but they're even matching a physician with an experienced APP. They've got to get to know each other's workflow. And so that's one of the barriers that we also saw. And so to Matt's point, I think, being aware of these things so that you can craft strategies around how to overcome them. Because I believe that, as we've mentioned, and this whole podcast is about, there's going to be more and more usage of advanced practice providers in the years ahead.
Yeah, which again, a great point both of you guys are making, because obviously the idea or the prospect of getting ahead of some of those barriers or some of those potential challenges that could come, it could make a major difference here. Because if we can at least agree the utilization and the roles of APPs are going to continue to grow and become more, the norm, I guess, making sure organizations can get ahead of that and be ahead of the curve a little bit, which also ties into one of the other things I wanted to ask you guys about. And Alex, you talked about this a little bit. A lot of this data that's collected, these surveys that are done, whether you're looking at it from a quantitative standpoint or qualitative, is understanding more and more about how organizations are or can compensate and incentivize APPs. What did you guys learn anything there from the survey?
We did. And to your point about existing survey data metrics, I think what we're seeing is recognition of higher usage of APPs and where that's going. Because where we used to predominantly look at financial metrics on a per physician FTE basis, we're now blending in and looking at it both on a per physician FTE basis as well as a per provider FTE basis that factors in the APP into those viewpoints. And so those benchmarks are becoming more robust and more applicable at the per provider level. In terms of compensation, I think the surveys capture amounts, but how are those compensation structures? How are those compensation models structured? And so we did see that mostly organizations do have a dedicated compensation strategy for their APPs, but still maybe a third of the organizations that responded do not. And it's likely that they have those advanced practice providers on what I would call an hourly nursing model, as opposed to having them compensated more like a provider and having an actual model that is administered for them. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see more and more organizations going is, one, it allows them to feel more valued as the provider and also gives them some upside incentive to accomplish the goals that are aligned with whatever the organizational objectives are. Now, one key dynamic to recognize is the differential in physician compensation versus APP compensation. And so because there's that differential, we see a difference in how some of those components are structured. Whereas on the APP side, we would expect to see base compensation make up a much larger portion of the overall compensation value, and then have some incentives that could be achieved on top of when that base salary is earned. And so we've done a lot of work with organizations trying to, solidify what their APP compensation strategy is. How do you have a model as opposed to managing, 100 different relationships or however many APPs that you've got, and they may be structured, a little bit differently.
And those structures are going to change a little bit based on specialty as well. So that's one thing that we did get into in our survey was primary care, medical or specialty care, surgical care, anesthesia, emergency, and hospital-based care. Those are the breakouts that we had. And of course, anesthesia and hospital-based care are going to be largely fixed salaries with very little productivity or quality incentives baked in, whereas primary care, they're closer to 79-80% is fixed, and then a much larger portion based with productivity and quality incentives. So it was just interesting seeing some of the breakout between those different compensation components. But yeah.
That'll also differ depending on the organization, because depending on just different factors, how many patients are there? You may not want to create a model that is incentivizing everyone over work RVUs, because you don't want to have the APP and the physician on the same care team fighting for those work RVUs. And so being mindful of what are you trying to accomplish and how are you tailoring incentives is very important. And we see that as being one of the main strategic objectives when developing an APP compensation plan.
Do you guys think that organizations are really going to need to or want to go through kind of a whole exercise, a whole process of rethinking about how they structure some of those comp plans and approaches to compensation and incentives for APPs? Meaning, Alex, you talked about some of the, some organizations are still kind of doing it what I would say is the traditional way of the hourly kind of nursing model versus, the true provider model, and the compensation incentives structures for those can really vary. Do you think this is going to be something where organizations are really going to have to take a step back and think more comprehensively, just as they've had to do in the past with their physician compensation models, but do the same thing for APPs? Or are they going to just kind of evolve and gradually get to kind of a steady state?
I think having a strategy is important, especially with how the growth projections, how meaningful APPs are going to be for patient care over the next 10 years and beyond. And we see a number of organizations do have that strategy in place. What's important to recognize is that the American healthcare finance system is so complicated, and our legislators are coming out with new rules all the time. They're evolving the ways that reimbursement flows. And so because of that, I think we have to acknowledge that provider compensation is a living, breathing organism. And you need a model that can adapt to some of those changes. It's not so rigid that it can't adapt, but it also on an every several year basis, it may be a good idea just to review the compensation structure that you have in place, both for physicians and for advanced practice providers. Is it adapting to market dynamics? Is it allowing you to shift where needed as reimbursement streams shift towards value-based dynamics? Some of those areas, and I think that's something that organizations they have a strategy, but how often do they review that strategy? And I think that's an important thing to consider.
From your consulting work and working with clients on these types of things, meaning compensation strategy, like take a health system with an employed network of physicians, APPs, and all types of other providers. And do you see that they are is it kind of either or, meaning like they have a comprehensive model for compensation and incentives for APPs, or is it you may have one system that has some on this model, some on that model, some over here doing something completely different. And if it's that, are there potential issues, and what are some things that maybe those types of organizations in that position should be considering?
It's a mixed bag. I think that over the past dozen years or whatever, we've seen healthcare organizations focus on acquiring critical mass. Mm-hmm. And those have resulted in different handshake deals where there are a lot of different arrangements in place. Now, as they've garnered that critical mass and developed a medical group that is comprised of, it's the physician enterprise that has advanced practice providers as a meaningful part, and it's absolutely a driving force of that medical group. It's important to have a model because, as you stated, the more variability there is, the more inequities that there are. And how do you ensure that it's just a best practice so that you have a standard approach that you can compensate people in like specialties and like manners and drive the incentives of the organization and align the incentives with what the providers desire to be incented upon. And so I think that healthcare organizations, a number of them do have a cohesive model, but there's always the need to understand we've got this asset now that is a medical group, and how do we get more out of that asset? And I think the first part is getting a good compensation model and structure in place so that you have standardized incentives, you have a model, you're not managing individual relationships. And then it's working with those providers on how do we get the most out of that asset? And that's where, that's a challenging thing as well, but you're talking about patient access initiatives. What do we, how do we come at this from a scheduling perspective? What's our philosophy there? How much engagement do the providers have in that? It's important that they have a voice within what that looks like, but you want to try to optimize that asset so that you can get the most out of that compensation plan and pay the providers at a high level and have them doing the things that they're incentivized to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess at some point, these organizations are going to have to at least consider, updating their models and trying to get them as consistent as possible across the board, or whether it's a single model or just something that can work more efficiently, if you will, as they continue to, as they move on from like you said, Alex, the stage of trying to just grow critical mass, but now we're trying to optimize it and while continuing to grow as well. I wanted to mention one thing, and this is a little bit of a deviation from the survey discussion, but certainly ties in. And I just want to put in a little, reminder for folks that we actually did a recent episode of the podcast with Alex, talking about some of the regulatory changes that are already starting to occur and others are anticipated to drop in the relatively near future here. So, but in terms of the way APPs are, the reimbursement flows, right, and the credit for production between doctors and APPs. Some changes there. We don't need to go into the details of that because, again, we had a full episode talking specifically about some of those changes that we anticipate and what that could mean. But Alex, if you don't mind, since you did that episode, maybe just give a little teaser on, some of the things that we talked about, because it does tie into organizations, how they utilize APPs, how they credit production, and then ultimately that inevitably is going to tie to compensation and incentives, both for the APPs and then for the MDs as well.
So one of the major changes that's coming, and CMS in their proposed rule, where the final rule is expected to be out at the beginning of November, but in their proposed rule, they have delayed it a year. And so in 2024, as it relates to facility visits, when there's a split visit, meaning an APP and a physician both see a patient, there's now guidance on how to credit billing and providing that work credit to the provider, and it will be based on the provider that provided the majority of care to the patients. And so that has big implications. If you think about certain specialties that round in the hospital, their APPs may spend most of the time with the with the patients, but the physician may come in, check on the patient for a brief period of time. Right now, the bill is able to go out under the physician's name, and the physician is getting that work RVU credit. In the future, it may not be that way. And if the advanced practice provider is spending the majority of time caring for the patient, the bill will go out under the APP, and it would then be the APP that would get that work credit. And so this does have an impact on how work RVUs are administered. And there could be strategic shifts that we see as a result of that. Meaning, is this going to result in changing the care model? And maybe you'll bring in more ISTs in the hospital space that are specialty focused to deal with those patients. But how do you credit the physician for seeing maybe more APPs if that's the focus on providing that care? And so there's a lot of dynamics and a lot of considerations to think through in that regard.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that because again, a lot of and helpful insight there that we talked about on that episode. But again, I think as we talked earlier about, some of the hurdles or some of the challenges that organizations may need to be thinking about, that's one more thing, because again, understanding a little bit more context about how organizations are utilizing APPs and what the go forward strategy is going to be as they continue to grow that utilization. And, and ultimately, as we see that trend continue, I think those are things regulatory wise that are going to factor in as well. So, I want to bring it full circle here. And as we close out, again, I'll remind folks more information as far as our analysis from the survey, some of the findings that Alex and Matt and others contributed to here from the data. We can certainly make that available. And then again, follow on conversation if you want to really dig into more specific data points or answer specific questions. Alex and Matt are always happy to do that. But what's kind of the future plans here for the survey? Because obviously we didn't want this to be a one-time thing, because trends are going to continue to evolve here. So we're going to have to kind of stay on this. Any insight there for listeners?
This was our inaugural survey, and so we will look to refresh it in the future. And I think that's going to be especially important as we've talked about the growth projections that we're seeing in APPs and in our work, the need for organizations to better craft their strategy around the usage of those APPs and how they compensate for them. And so, we'll have plans to refresh this and so that we can kind of make sure that we're staying up with the latest trends and have numbers and stats to support the experiences that we engage with our clients.
Great. Well, I appreciate you guys spending at least a few minutes here talking about some of the high level findings and observations. Once again, I'll just say there's a lot of meat behind this. So I really encourage folks, if they're interested, reach out to Alex, Matt, any of us here at Coker, and we'll point you in the right direction to get those questions answered. But we'll definitely look forward to continuing this process of providing some context around some of what's going on out there and the data points and really breaking it down so organizations can have meaningful information that they can then implement in their own practices and hospitals. So I appreciate this from you guys. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to learn more in the future. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure being on.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.